I understand that recording is happening. I understand that we have folks from a pretty big geographic range this evening that are with us as well, that this was available to across the state, and probably some folks from Oregon as well. Ashley and I both work for the Clark Conservation District. So we're really working on the mission of preserving the natural resources and conserving them for the Clark County area, primarily, the mission focused around water and soil health, but that expands into a whole lot of areas in our natural resources. For those of you that aren't in the Clark County area, quick search, you should be able to find your local conservation district that often maps your county lines, but not necessarily. Conservation districts are a great place to find support for landowners trying to find knowledge or assistance and resources in various projects that might be beneficial to your property and then the community as a whole. So a lot of stuff we work on that we could talk about, but this evening is slated for meadowscaping. So we can proceed into the conversation. I think Ashley's going to get us started with some of the concepts.
Thank you. So to start us off, I think this quote gets at kind of why we all are here. We are gardeners, or maybe we're striving to be ones. We are also humans that are a part of our environment. So more and more, I think people are asking these questions of like, how can they be managing their yards to fulfill those functions that they're finding out in nature. So I really love this quote. We have to raise the bar on our landscapes. In the past, we have asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. Now they have to support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. So what is a meadow and meadowscaping? Why are we here? You may have heard of other terms like naturescaping, maybe something like pollinator habitats or hedgerows, or even just the terms backyard habitat and like the backyard habitat program. What do they all mean and how do they actually relate to what we're talking about tonight, meadowscaping? I like to think of the term naturescaping as kind of an umbrella term. It's a method of landscape design that bridges kind of those natural elements through the use of native plants to attract something like wildlife, pollinators, and it also helps protect our watersheds and environment. We need to consider what is the natural environment that we are working towards and creating in our landscape and our yards. Creating meadowscapes are a great way to support native wildlife and habitats while having an aesthetically pleasing yard. I hope that by the end of this presentation, we will all understand the form and functions of a meadowscape space, as well as steps to create one. I also hope that we'll understand that you can help achieve conservation and increase biodiversity and reduce ecological footprints through providing meadowscapes. And meadowscapes are a great alternative to lawns. They provide native plants in a garden-like setting. So I like to start out with definitions. I think it's really important that we all understand these three terms and how basically prairie and meadows kind of join together to create this term meadowscaping. So prairies are natural systems that are dominated by grass and other non-woody vegetation. Some examples are camas, delphinium, yarrow, violets, goldenrods, all these beautiful flowers. You can find both wetland prairies as well as terrestrial or sometimes called dry prairies. Meadows are a tract of land that is also similarly dominated by grass and non-woody plants. In its natural state, you could think of something like a forest meadow, an open area. But you can also use this term to describe something like a pasture and in some cases, urban lawns. So meadowscaping, like I said, is kind of mixing these two together. It is the actual practice of designing and implementing an urban meadow to replace these lawns. They provide an ecological function such as habitat for pollinators or maybe some stormwater improvements. How I think prairies really come into this is that we are using our native prairie species for our meadowscapes. So no matter where you're coming from, you can look to your local native prairie species to create those species lists. So I wanted to give a little bit of background of why this is so important on the landscape. The history of these prairies and meadows is so important. And as you can see in this map, this is the historic range of prairies. This is one of the rarest ecosystems. We in the Pacific Northwest call them shortgrass prairies. You may think of the prairie systems in the Midwest, which are called longgrass prairies. I think is pretty self-explanatory. So there is less than 3% of historical prairies remaining. It is believed to be created by the receding glaciers in the last ice age. Native Americans maintained the prairies through burning, which helped provide food sources such as camas. So all of the species that are found in prairies are adapted to this regular disturbance. So keep that in mind as you are designing your meadowscape. Additionally, as of like 2005, which we can only imagine it's more now, 32 to 40 million acres of land has been converted to lawn, thus giving us an amazing opportunity to reclaim that in our own backyard. So I just wanted to bring up again, the landscape importance and kind of that history of what's happening. That's why we're kind of losing our prairies. So one of them is understory competition. Prairies, because they are adapted to that regular disturbance, they work in kind of the successional state from that non-woody vegetation to a forest state. And with the removal of fire on our landscapes, we are starting to find more and more understory shrubs moving in. One thing you could think about is blackberries that move into those areas. They like those sunny open areas, similarly to where you would find prairies. Another good one is Scotch broom that moves in. Again, another species that really likes that sunny area. So that moves into, as it moves along, you have your shrubs, and then you'll start having tree species being established and eventually moving into conifer encroachment. And again, that all has to do with that lack of disturbance, the lack of fire on the landscape. The other thing that conifers start doing is shading the area and basically creating a new type of plant palette within the area, therefore moving to a forested system. The last one I think is one of the biggest detriments to our prairie system, and that's land conversion. And that is, you can think about is as people came out and were settling, or you're looking at it for a place to put your property, what's easier? An area like a pasture that's already been cleared and you don't have to clear a forest to put your house. It's a lot easier to put it in those areas. And so that's been historically why this landscape has decreased. But it's not all bad. Prairies do have some amazing aspects to them. They have over 200 species. There are over 200 species that are associated with oak and prairie habitats. For instance, the western gray squirrel, there's an abundance of butterfly species, the pocket gopher, raptors, western meadowlark. There's also a number of endangered and critically listed species that are associated with prairie habitats. And of course, I think one of our favorites, pollinator species. I think that this is one of the most popular groups of species, especially or wildlife. when we're starting to think about creating habitat in our backyard and in our gardens. Beneficial insects are those that act as predators on pest species, so they can be amazing for our backyards. One of the most popular ones that you might think of is a lady beetle with an aphid. There's also other things that act as pollinators like birds, beetles, which I recently learned that 1 in 4 species is a beetle. So I'm just blown away. There's tons of beetles out there that can act. And then, you have wasps and flies and other things that can act as those beneficial insects. In Washington, we have over 600 native bee species. So it's a great place to provide habitat for those species.
All right, so moving into why we meadowscape, why are folks here this evening? And there could be a lot of reasons that draw you to wanting to do this in your own space. And although one of these might not be the primary reason that motivates you, there may still be this effect. So a lot of this is great to keep in mind with it. One of the first things we're doing is, as Ashley mentioned, naturescaping. We're incorporating a natural system into our built environment. So for a long time, there's been a tradition of kind of having our built environment with the house, manicured, mowed lawn, hedgerows, mulched underneath nicely. And there's been more and more of a movement to think about how to incorporate different natural systems and natural looks into your built environment with that. And there's a lot of benefits that come from that we'll talk about. One of which being that you're creating a novel ecosystem. And so the concept of a novel ecosystem is that if these species that were dependent on a prairie ecosystem in a more natural state where they would find it, can find a little niche in your backyard, you've created a little miniature ecosystem right there. And we know that a lot of insects and bird species that are able to hop from property to property really benefit from this in urban environments in particular. But this can also be done in a rural area on a large scale too. So whatever scale you're working with, you're creating that benefit. There's also a utility aspect that could draw a lot of people to this. Meadows can be, as Ashley mentioned, wet meadow. So you could do something that's going to be similar to a rain garden design where you're trying to deal with drainage issues. Or maybe you have the opposite problem and you have an incredibly dry yard and you want to work with more species that are going to be drought tolerant. So there's a lot of utility design that you could think about with this. And then finally, just the joy of creation. The act of designing and putting this together and watching it grow is a big benefit. If somebody were to ask many people, if somebody asked myself, why do you garden? Well, there's a very obvious utility to the vegetables that you get from it, but really for myself, and I think many others, it's the act of doing it that draws you to it. And so this can be one of those as well. Go to the next slide for me, Ashley. So expanding a little bit on form and function, the functional space that you're creating, lawns can be a functional space as well if you're using them as such, and there's no reason not to keep a patch of lawn in your landscape. But sometimes if you're just mowing that grass repeatedly and thinking it's not doing anything for you, you could design a little bit more function to that, whether that function be for you or other species like we've been talking about, or a utility purpose. So a lot of functional design can be incorporated. Expanding upon this concept of diversity and a niche ecosystem that you can be creating, a good concept to think about that's talked about with backyard bird habitat programs is that a lot of our native plant species and our native insects have co-evolved together. And so there's relationships where a particular insect might need a particular plant or set of plants for part of their life cycle. And that insect might be an important part of a particular bird's life cycle, often when they're feeding their young. So a bird that maybe feeds on seeds and fruits when it's an adult needs particular grubs of a set of insects to feed their young. And there's particular native plants that they depend on. So it can be a really fun research project to look into these and try to incorporate that into your own meadow space that you're trying to create at home, if you're trying to add that to some of your favorite species that you want to be benefiting. Some really good resources to look into for that: Backyard Bird Habitat Program, the Audubon Society, and another great one is the Xerxes Society, that you can find a lot of information about the different insects locally with that too. The aesthetic value, oh, sorry, I can go back one. The aesthetic value that you can add to a space. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but I think many of us, at least in attendance here tonight, would think that something that incorporates a lot more form and color is going to be more beautiful than just a flat lawn space. And so you can be adding a lot of aesthetic that you appreciate. I think something that's really great about these settings, particularly the one in this photo that you see on the upper left there, this is in an urban area. And so you're not only adding that for yourself, but your community, and folks are seeing that. I think it's a great inspirational point, inspires others, can be educational. And with a lot of the native species that you're picking, you're also showcasing some of the heritage of our area and region. And then there's also unseen benefits. I included this slide showing the roots because we think of the diversity of the plants and everything they're doing on the surface, but there's a huge network of microbial and fungal systems in the soil as well. And so thinking about when you plant this mix of species, you're also getting a lot more diversity underground that's going to increase the health of the soil as well in the area. All right, types of meadowscaping. So as I mentioned, you can go large or you can go small with this. If you have a large area that's dominated by one or two grass species and you want to incorporate some more native species into the mix, maybe you end up coming up with a plan to do that. Maybe you do islands of it throughout it. You can do something on a larger scale. You can also do something in a very small scale with a backyard space. Ashley has a future slide that kind of shows how you can incorporate some different stuff around your home. The photo on the right is a great example of a really well planned out rain garden planting where we have kind of our sidewalk strip area and the rain garden. So this is serving a utility function. It's got pollinator habitat and great aesthetic value that's all incorporated into this and using a lot of what would be meadow species. I'll note that the lavender is not necessarily a native species, and there's no hard rule here that you have to only use natives with it. So you can incorporate other pieces with that as well. And you can use it in a variety of settings, dry spaces or wet spaces, sun or shade, although I will say that most meadow species are going to want more sun. We're going to be looking at least 6 hours of sun a day. And there are going to be some that can tolerate a little more shade, but generally this is a sunny set of species. But we'll talk a little bit later too about trying to design it to fit the conditions of your space. One more. And yeah, oh yeah, sorry, that next slide. Yeah, so bearing in mind, creating your vision with the space that you have in mind. So in my experience, you can have a client that wants to create a particular vision in their space. Maybe they have some favorite species, they have some feature and design that they want, but it might not necessarily match with the space they have to use. And I think it's really important, and I always advise people to start with that in mind. Look at what you have and what would do well there. Then expand into that thought of, is there a utility function that I want? What are the pieces that I find pretty? What are the parts that could be incorporated for some habitat that I want to add? So work with the space that you have, consider those conditions to try to incorporate that, and then start drafting your plan of what you want to do. And as we talk about the installation, bear in mind that successional planting and successional planning about the establishment of your meadow is going to be really important, because you're not going to be able to plant everything and then get the full meadow you envisioned in year one. You might, depending on the species selection, but chances are this is going to be something that takes a little bit of time to establish the way you want it. And a more natural system is going to have that type of diversity and produce over time for you. And I think Ashley now is going to talk a little bit more about part of that installation process. I do want to say, for some folks' questions that I've seen popping up, there's a lot of stuff that I've seen that we will cover over the course of this and then get to the Q&A at the end. So I don't want people to feel like we're just blowing through this and ignoring anything that's coming up.
Great. So yeah, now I hope you guys are all starting to feel very motivated and you're, excited to get out there, get your meadow going, rip out those weeds, rip out your lawn and convert over. I think that this slide is really great because it's a way to look, you want to look at your whole property and start thinking about where you're going to be placing those meadows. As Brendan had stated, thinking about the sunlight in areas or water. So I just love this example because it just kind of shows how you could have multiple different types of meadows within your property. And again, thinking about those specific site conditions and playing with what you have. So to get started, what should you do first? I think the first thing to do is test your soil. You're going to be wanting to look for infiltration. That is the ability of the water or of the soil to drain water. So you can also look at the structure of the soil. And that's through a thing called the soil texture test. So you may have seen before where somebody will grab some soil, they'll wad it up into a ball, and then you kind of just see how it clumps together or if it falls apart. And that just starts telling you a little bit about your soil. Do you have more of a clay soil that's going to hold that water more? Or do you have something more like a sandy loam or sandy soil that's really going to be draining? And again, that's going to help you start keying into what types of meadows you're going to be putting on your property. The other thing you can do is take a sample and send it to the lab. It's so easy to do it. It sounds like, oh, I'm just sending a lab sample. It must be complicated. Literally get your shovel out, dig a hole, put it in a bag, and you send it to the lab. And that is a way that will allow you to test things like pH, nutrients, available nitrogen. If you are interested, the district has a soil testing kit that will walk you through it. And it also has a list of labs in the region and what they specifically test for. So contact us if you are interested in that. And just again, by testing your soils, you will have a better idea of the specific microhabitat at your site and the species you can select. Oftentimes there are maps that will show kind of regionally what soils you have, but specifically testing at your site will let you know that specific soil at your place. So, and again, it lets you allow to pick those wetland prairie species or drought tolerant species. It also will let you know the health of your soil and if you have good biology. If you look at this picture, you can kind of see of the hand being held out, you can see kind of how the soil is clumped together. There's lots of roots. Getting at that under the soil ecosystem that Brendan mentioned earlier. So, site prep is the most important part of the project, in my opinion, but I think it's a pretty, I think that this can literally make or break your project. And this is especially true in meadow systems. Prairie species are used to that disturbance, and the weed pressure can be, it's, you know, you can't just like shade them out. They're just a little bit hard, like weeds can impact them a lot more than some other species. So you just really want to think about your site prep and give yourself enough time to get it done and get it done in a good fashion so that your project is successful. So the first site prep method is sheet mulching. And this is something that I did on my own property. And so these are photos from my backyard. And the sheet mulching, or also sometimes called the lasagna method, is something that you're going to want to have start several months before you're planning to actually plant. It can also be in conjunction with spraying or mowing and like hand digging out some weeds. So if you are planning a fall planting, you would want to start the previous spring with your sheet mulching. And that is at the latest, like you want to give it that long period of time. So how do you do it? Well, first you're going to mow your vegetation, remove the debris, and then you're going to lay down your cardboard, having it overlap. And then you're going to be, and you can also, if you don't have cardboard, you can also use like about 4 to 6 layers of newspaper, a good amount of paper. And then once you have that all laid down, you'll put a nitrogen source, something like a weed-free manure or compost, and then you'll put a layer of carbon material such as leaves, straw, bark, or shredded paper, for mine, I wasn't originally thinking like I was going to meadowscape everywhere. I have some fruit trees, so one of my goals was really just to get a good layer of mulch down, and then I'm going to be meadowscaping certain areas of my backyard. And so I actually used Chip Drop, which is a free chip drop. It's working okay, but I want to remind you that be really careful with it because it isn't weed free. And it also can come with larger chunks of material that can take longer to break down. So keep that in mind. So finally, if you want, you can put down a layer of like coffee burlap sack down, and that can help kind of keep things in place. This is especially helpful if you're like working in a smaller area. And if you have any issues with it becoming too moist, you can also use a sheet of plastic, which kind of gets me to the next site prep method, solarization. This works by heating up the ground and cooking the plants, seeds, insects, and other soil pathogens. You can use, like, again, spraying, mowing, hand pulling, and all of that stuff beforehand. And then you can lay down your black or clear plastic sheet and allow it to sit over the summertime. So you might be looking at this picture, and I have an example of black plastic as well as clear plastic. There is a lot of debate in the literature about which one you should use. Some people have strong feelings on a particular one. My thoughts is you should use whichever one you have, but the benefits of using the clear plastic is it allows for photosynthesis to happen. So for the sun to come through, and then any seeds that are in your underneath there that you didn't get, it allows the plants will grow, and then they will get hot, and then they'll die, and then some more will grow, hot, die, and kind of do that cycle. The black plastic, on the other hand, doesn't allow for photosynthesis. So that's also, in terms, as well as heating up, it also isn't allowing for photosynthesis. So again, it's a debate. I think just whatever one you have is what you should use. So you're gonna make sure the biggest thing with this is you wanna give it enough time on the ground, leaving it at minimum, like usually March through September. And that's September because as soon as you remove it, you want to be immediately planting. So make sure to keep that in mind for your planning. This is a really awesome example from Northwest Meadowscapes about a seed company, about how you can convert a pasture land into a prairie system. And while this is a big scale, these concepts I think can be, brought down to the smaller scale as well. And what's really cool about this is that seeds are really expensive. And this method is a way that allows you to kind of reuse the seed use the seeds that your plants are producing. So what you do is you will start with the solarization method. You'll get your area prep, you'll plant your meadow. And then the next season, right adjacent to your established meadow, you will start a new area of solarization. And then once it's ready to go, you will remove it. You will then rake over the chaff and existing stuff from that existing meadow into the new area. One thing you will want to consider is if you do have any weed species in your existing meadow, you'll want to make sure to get those out or just be mindful of that in the process. But like I said, it is a great way to continue having expanding your meadow in a way, and also saving money on seeds. So the final two site prep methods are spraying. And like I said, that can be in conjunction with the last two methods. Spraying often works best on a smaller area. So as you can see in this picture, doing it in one of those little strips along the road. And that's just because pesticides can be really expensive. You also want to think about, where it's located, and if that is having a lot of, like, you're near a stream or water body or some sort of filtration, you might want to avoid the spraying method in that. The other thing is, for certain places and applications, you might actually need to have some sort of license to get the pesticide and to spray it. And the other thing you want to really make sure, if this is the method you choose, is to use the correct pesticide. So if you have grasses or broadleaf species, you want to make sure that you're choosing one that is going to properly kill the species that you have. And as is the law, make sure to follow the label for those. The other final method that you see down there is kind of like the quick and dirty method. It is just renting a sod cutter, which can be a little bit more expensive. But you rent that and you literally can cut out your grass, your vegetation, and remove it, and then have that exposed dirt below, and it's ready to go. With this, you will need to consider where that sod is going afterwards. So I'm going to move on to plant selection, sourcing, and installation. So 40 to 60% of plants in the meadows are grasses. So really what you're going to be getting is grasses and perennials, and those are most likely going to be coming as bulbs, plugs, and seeds. So when you're choosing your plants, you want to make sure to have a diversity of colors, a range of bloom times, having them from the spring to the fall, textures, a variety of different textures. And what that means is having like different forbs, grasses, hollow stems, different heights. So you can kind of think of it, it's not just one uniform thing. And then different shapes of flowers. And also, to maximize the success of your planting, you want to get a good amount of plants in an area. So you want to plant your plants in clumps, and usually clumps of 3 to 5 are both aesthetically pleasing, as well as they actually are really great for pollinators because it concentrates things like their nectar sources. The final thing I wanted to say about this is, when you're sourcing seeds, make sure that they're actually native to your region. Oftentimes those ones that you find in the big box stores aren't actually native if you look at the things. So think about that if that is one of your goals. This is a really cool list of from the Xerces Society that shows different pollinator plants. And what I like about this, and there's a lot of other types of lists similar to this, but it will show you those different bloom times, colors, heights of plants, so that you can use that when selecting your plant palette. So, installation. Your soil has been prepped through one of the methods we already talked about. Hopefully it is free of all weeds and any unwanted species. And then you can put down a fine layer of mulch or compost to help kind of get your plants ready for planting. Ideally, you're going to be doing the planting in the fall. I like to say September, after kind of that first rainfall event. This is especially helpful to think about with your seed species, because once you're spreading those seeds out there, you don't want to be doing it in like earlier when it is actually really hot and there's not as much water on the ground. And that also gives the seeds enough time to establish over winter and be ready for the spring. The other thing you want to do is lay out your pots, plugs where you want. And again, think about those clumping of 3 to 5 plants. So this is just another really cool pollinator. If you're hoping to, utilize the meadow for pollinators, these are 2 great resources on attracting native pollinators as well as beneficial insects. So with that.
All right, so I'm going to expand on a couple of the species you might want to consider. We've only got 8 of them here, and there's hundreds to pick from, but this will kind of give you a little bit of a starting point to think about. So as we mentioned, grasses, can be a real dominant part of your meadow and prairie area that you're trying to replicate. So two that we've showcased here is the tufted hairgrass, Deschampsia. This and the fescue are both bunch grasses, which are what our native grasses in this area are. So traditionally you wouldn't have had turf grass growing, you would have had these kind of bunch grass meadows and prairies. So the tufted hairgrass, a semi-evergreen perennial, it starts with this nice green clump early in the season and then is going to grow these tall stalks with the golden stalks with the seed heads on top. So you get a nice variety of showiness throughout the year from it. The fescue, we picked a Romer's fescue here. This was once a really common species in the Willamette Valley oak savanna, so you're helping showcase part of that native species from the grasslands. Worth noting, if you are looking at these from a nursery, they sometimes might be growing a fescue that is not a native variety. So if you're particularly trying to go for that, just ask the provider you're going with to try to help you identify that. Next up, couple of Carrick species here are sedges. Slough sedge, this one is pretty easy to grow. It will do well in sun. It can tolerate the shade decently as well. It likes a perennial wet setting. So this is a really good choice if you're doing a rain garden setting. These are a workhorse in rain garden and stormwater facilities. And they grow rhizominously, meaning so if you plant a few, the roots will spread and kind of fill in a space. So that's one thing as you start to plan your planting design, you can help pick a couple, set them in the area, let them fill into the space that you have in mind. So the slough sedge, great species for that, really tough, relatively easy to maintain out of them. The dense sedge, another compact sedge, again, likes a perennial wet environment, the moisture soils. So these are good ones to pick if you're looking at more of a wet meadow replication. Part of the reason I picked the dense sedge is the dense sedge has these really nice, as the name implies, dense seed heads at the top. Most of your sedges will have a type of seed head that you can see. It just kind of adds another nice visual and a food source to species.
Yeah, and I'll just add that slough sedge is really good, especially they, like Brendan mentioned, are workhorses and a great species.
Continuing with nice visuals, the prunella or self-heal or heal-all. This is has medicinal properties, hence the names. This is a perennial herb in the mint family, and it grows these really beautiful purple cone flowers that you'll see on the top, low lying, good ground cover. It will create little patches and spread in that space. And then after the flower petals pass in the summer, you're left with dried flower cone that lasts through the fall and winter. So that's a nice touch with that too. It doesn't just entirely disappear from the surface before regrowing the next season. And then a big star for our local meadows is the common camas. So these wonderful purple flowers that we'll see in the late spring, early summer, and a really great heritage piece as a traditional food source. The camas grows a bulb in the ground that's kind of a potato-like starch food. But even if you're not going to be harvesting them for food at all, just a wonderful piece to add to your meadow and showcase. There was a question just real quick on the prunella as a mint family. Yes, it does spread. I wouldn't say it does it as aggressively as your other mint varieties, but it'll fill in a little patch. It's not going to take over the whole yard. If you're looking for a taller flower species, I think fireweed is a great one that can grow 3 to 5 feet tall, create a little clump. Great for pollinators. I know fireweed honey is one of my favorite varieties out there. So fireweed can be a nice choice for that. And another excellent choice for pollinators is yarrow. Yarrow is an herb that has a wonderful smell of the plant itself and the flower that you can cut and dry for that purpose. Really hardy, easy to grow, and great for pollinators, which I know Ashley's commented that she likes incorporating it with her fruit trees. So if you have fruit trees nearby, something like that's a great choice to help support them.
Yeah, and they are good for beneficial insects for some of the pests of fruit trees. I learned that from an orchardist. So that's a really fun one to have. And then also I was going to mention that fireweed you can also eat in salads, apparently. The young shoots is really good.
And so then talking about establishment and maintenance. So one thing that we want to make sure that people don't walk away with thinking is that lots of times there's conversation that when you start to incorporate native species into your plantings, that's a lower maintenance, that, you know, you don't have to do all the upkeep you would with a lawn. And that might not necessarily be the case. You know, as we talked about earlier, these are disturbed environments naturally with either fire or browsing. And so you're going to be interacting with it. You're going to have other grass and weed species. You know, so like anything else in your landscape that you have to maintain, you're still maintaining it. But the benefit to native species is that often they are adapted to our natural weather cycles. So they're used to a lot of rain in the rainy season and then going through these long dry spells. So you won't have to water as much once established. It's really important for the first 2 years to really make sure that you're watering as they're establishing through the summer, and then continuing to keep an eye on it and water your established plants, particularly if you have a summer like we did last year. You're probably going to be watering things regardless of how established they are. The weeding and the mulching where you need to, as mentioned with that, and then bringing up again that succession and the maintenance of it as your plants kind of grow and fill in different spaces, and you get to play around with manipulating that how you want. And Ashley, do you want to talk about this great resource that we'll have available to folks?
Yeah, so this is the Meadowscaping Handbook. I have one, but you can get a digital copy. Erica will post into the chat a link for that. It is a great resource from West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District down in Portland, so very close by. And honestly, pretty much everyone in this region uses this because it really steps you through the process and goes through a lot of what we were talking about tonight. So you can check that out for yourself, and feel free to contact us if you have any additional questions from that.
There was a question earlier about species list, and this handbook has that amongst many other things in here. That's a good reference point.
Yeah, it has it like several different versions of like with photos, without, all sorts of things. So yeah.